One thing that's clear is that the more affluent a country is, the more affluent people are, the more their demand for meat goes up, the higher their demand for meat is. And that can be seen in this plot here, which has the gross domestic product of nations on the x-axis, and it's on some weird log scale. But the point is, as you move to the right, the GDP per capita goes up, and as the GDP per capita goes up, clearly meat consumption goes up. Of course, there's a lot of variation there. A country like Japan, for the relatively same level of GDP, consumes less meat per capita, per person, than Israel, for example. And so this plot can be just very instructive for helping us understand that the demand for meat and milk would follow the same sort of pattern. Livestock products, the demand for livestock products goes up as affluence goes up. Not surprising, but interesting to see those data. And this helps explain some of the components of U.S. land use. So we're looking just at the United States, and we look at the way we use our land. There are forests and shrublands. We see agriculture, grasslands, and pasture split out here, and then other types of uses, urban areas down at the bottom. And it's interesting to see the total amount of land that's used for these various uses. Agriculture and grasslands and pasture have about an equal share of 530,400 square miles of land used for agriculture, that is to say row crop agriculture. In this part of the world, corn and soybean production, wheat production. And this is a map that's showing the same thing, just in a more spatially explicit way. And so we see that those values of 530,000 square miles translate to almost 340 million acres. So almost 340 million acres of agriculture in the U.S. and about the same, or maybe exactly the same, in grassland and pasture. And of course, the grassland and pasture distribution is skewed to the west, where it's drier and warmer and less productive. And so those tend to be what we call rangelands, where you basically, as an agricultural producer, you graze livestock predominantly and take what you can get from the grasslands that are there. Whereas in the east, and especially in the Corn Belt, which are these reddish pink dots, that sort of agriculture is rain-fed agriculture predominantly, but there are significant inputs to the system in the form of nutrients, fertilizers, and that sort of thing, and seed. And and most of the crops in this part of the world are planted each year. If we look at a breakdown of those systems, we can see that these agricultural regions can be broken down into various crop types. And so wheat production is this orangest color, and you can see that wheat has been planted in a lot of parts of the rangeland in the western part of the U.S., in the Great Plains, etc. And as we move into these greener and this more lighter color orange, we get much more corn and soybean production. And in fact, the orange and the green sort of overlap here so much that it's hard to discern the two. But they dominate what we would call the upper Midwest or the north central region. And you can see here at the bottom that I've annotated that that translates to about 100 million acres of corn, about 39% of it used for livestock feed, and about 67 million acres of soybeans, about 70% of that used for livestock feed. And so here's a breakdown of what happens to corn, field corn that's grown in the U.S. And that's field corn should be distinguished from sweet corn, which is what we humans eat as corn on the cob. And that's really very few acres compared to field corn. Field corn is grown for these types of feedstock uses. And you can see here that 39%, almost 40%, is used for livestock feed, and then that's broken down further into beef, dairy, swine, poultry, and other livestock uses here on the right. And you can see that Most of it is used, well, it's sort of evenly distributed among poultry, swine, beef, and dairy cows. I guess if you combine the beef and the dairy, then most of it's used for cows. So interestingly, almost 30% of the corn that we grow goes to ethanol these days. Some 10 years ago or so, I think Claudio and I used an estimate of 40% or 39%. It was much higher about a decade ago. It's around 27% nowadays. And then a significant amount of the field corn that we produce is exported. It's put on barges and moved down the Mississippi River or out through the Hudson Bay and finds its way to uh, um, China, it finds its way to Japan, it finds its way to Europe and other places. But as Mike pointed out in his lecture the other day, mostly that corn is finding its way to affluent countries that are buying that corn. I mean, that's the reason that we export it. It's because it fetches a price. And then food and industrial uses of corn primarily include using the corn for sweeteners. So high fructose corn syrup is sort of the main food and industrial use of corn. And of course, that high fructose corn syrup can go into lots and lots of different products that tend to occupy as Michael Pollan says, the middle part of the store, the places where things are boxed and help sweeten it and keep it fresh. So as I have annotated here at the bottom, um, about 39 million acres of corn is used for livestock feed. Um, and about 10 million acres of corn is used for beef production. Okay, if we look at soybeans, we can look at where that goes, and you can see that with this kind of cute graphic, who ate all the soybean meal. Most of it goes to feeding chickens. A lot of it goes to feeding hogs, primarily in Iowa. Um, but a lot of it goes into feed rations for dairy cows. A lot of it goes to feed turkeys. And then there's this other, which is for pets, beef cattle, aquaculture, sheep and goats. So it really isn't used significantly to feed beef cattle, but of course it is used for these other animals. So about 47 million acres of soybeans for livestock feed, about 1 million acres for cows. So if we add all that up, what we're looking at is in the US, about 12 million acres of land are used for cow feed. So for beef production. Another way of thinking about that is that about 40% of our land, of our agricultural land, is used for beef production. So when we think about beef production that way, we're talking primarily about beef cattle that are being fed in a confinement situation. And so over here on the left-hand side of this plot, we're talking about grain-finished beef cattle. So they're confined in feedlots primarily, and there's about 29 million head of beef that are finished this way every year. Those feedlots tend to be in the Great Plains, but not exclusively. They also can be found in California and in the East as well. It's important to note that all beef cows are grass-fed for much of their life. Most of the beef cows are born in rangelands of the West and grazed in the early part of their lives. But most of them, 95% of them, are finished on grain and feedlots. And a lot of that's historical. A lot of that is because finishing them on grain can help fatten them very quickly and help them gain weight in a really timely way for production reasons. So there has been a big movement towards grass-finished beef, and so you can see here we have about 1.5 million head of grass-finished beef. So these are beef cows that are raised their entire life on grass, so they're grazing pasture. And when we look at this table, the reason I built this table was just to kind of do a comparison of what might be possible. So if we look at our 12 million acres of corn and soybean that are used to feed grain finished beef now, That's a production level of about 2.5 head of beef cattle per acre. So as I mentioned, you can really feed a lot of cows on grain, and you can get a lot of cow production on beef production on grain. And in fact, it's about 2.4 head per acre. On the other hand, pasture raised or grass raised, grass finished beef, um, really we're looking at an average of about 1 head per acre. But what's important to note here is that averaging over all the acres out there is kind of silly because we have some very highly productive land. We have some very low productive land. And a really high productive land, you can raise a grass finished uh, beef cow on, sorry, you can raise as many as 2 or 3 um, beef cows on 1 acre of land. But as the land gets less productive, there's less rainfall, fewer nutrients in the soil, et cetera. As you move west, basically in the U.S., we get into situations where you can really only raise about a half of a beef cow per acre. So on average, let's just call it 1 head per acre for now. So the grass produced on highly productive cropland now, if we give a sort of conservative estimate, we might say we could raise 2 head per acre. So there really is a capacity out there for about 24 million head of beef grazing pasture on what is now corn and soybean land that's used to feed cows. So in other words, this is all sort of a long-winded way of saying we use much of the grain that we grow now and much of the land that we use to grow that grain to feed livestock in confinement situations. But if we took all of that land out of corn and soybean production and put it into grass, which would give us all kinds of other ecosystem services that I've talked about in other lectures, then we could still produce almost as much beef on that same land that we do now. And so we need to think hard about what kind of a landscape we want, what we want out of our agricultural systems. And as we think about that, we have to think about how to incentivize more grass finished, more grassland based agriculture.